me now introduce our first workshop presenter, Pastor Dave Lee. Dave serves as the lead pastor of Harvest Community Church, a majority Asian American congregation in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. He has served at Harvest since its founding in 1995. In 2012, Dave co-founded Thrive, a small network of churches committed to church health through deeper community and support among pastors and church leaders. In 2017, Dave co-founded Pastors, Academics, and Counselors Together, PACT, a safe space for professionals from these three sectors to form trusting relationships and to learn from one another. Dave is married to Jeannie, and they have 4 adult children. In his spare time, Dave is passionate about urban sketching and pickleball. Welcome, Dave.
First day of the conference was really great because I think beyond just the ministry context, there were so many powerful implications for our own mental health and what we bring to our work out of our family life, our personal life, our heritage. Today, this morning, and especially in this track, I'm going to be focusing on the leadership development part of that, the implications of our Asian American heritage, and some of the artifacts of that in our formation as leaders, how that affected us. And I'm going to do it through the lens of exploring leadership anxiety, which is definitely a mental health issue. Some disclaimers I want to give. First, the flow of generations is always going to be a clumsy, turbulent process, no matter what. But I think it's especially pronounced in immigrant context, because you add to the regular flow of generations certain things that do violence to the normal transition of people. And when you have that, it complicates everything. It introduces new factors to a process that's already fraught with complication and tension. I know that because my wife, my children and I share the same language. We like the same shows and movies. I even play the same video games as my sons. And yet, there's been a lot of turbulence in the flow of generations between us. And so I know that normally it's going to be a hard thing, but in an immigrant context, and especially between the first and second generation of immigrants, it's a very, very difficult thing. I want to explore that, and so I think it's important that I make a few disclaimers up front, just so that you know that I know that there are going to be exceptions to what I'm addressing. First, I'm a pastor and not a scholar. I just gave some opening remarks before the audience kicked in for air meet that I'm the furthest thing from a scholar. When my youngest daughter found out I was coming to Princeton to give a talk, she said, "You're going to be the dumbest guy in the room," and I think she's right. So my qualifications are not because I have done academic research at a rigorous level, but I think what I can bring to the table is this. I've pastored at the same church for almost 30 years. And I've watched, I think you get a view of the body of Christ that's very different when you stay in one place for a very long time, watch an entire generation grow up. When you marry the children of the people you've married, I think you develop a different kind of anthropological insight on what church is than people who are perpetually starting over with new groups every 3 to 5 years. And so that's a source of insight that I think has been very rich for me personally, has helped me navigate a lot of the things that are unknown. And so that's kind of my framework. I've been at the same church for 29 years now, and I've been there long enough. I'm in my mid-50s now, I'm 56. And so I am old enough to have started as the next generation and now have become the previous generation. And that's a really weird dynamic. We have all these 30-year-olds at our church, and I'm old enough to be their father, which is crazy to me. And yet that's the emerging generation. That's the future of our church. And I am now representative of the generation that's in authority. So whatever I felt about the previous generation, whatever frustrations I might have had, I recognize now more and more that I am guilty of some of those same things. I'm just doing it in English, but I'm doing a lot of the same things. And it's the comments and the experiences of the now emerging generation of new leaders that's helping me. It's holding up a mirror to how much I've inherited, both good and bad, in the generation that preceded me. I'm also recognizing that we're not all Korean Americans. I am. It's the context I know and understand the best. I have had lots of interactions in navigating generational dynamics as a friend, as a colleague, a consultant for many different people groups in the United States. And so what I'm finding is there are a lot of common threads, but there are a lot of distinctives that I think shouldn't be shortchanged. I'm going to give the disclaimer that today I'm going to largely speak out of my own context, and I'm going to ask you to indulge me and do the translation work into your own context the best that you can, recognizing that some of the peculiarities of the Korean American setting have very little to do with the setting that you're in. I also recognize that a lot of immigrant groups in the US, even represented at this conference, are well beyond first and second generation dynamics. Some are in the fourth, fifth, even eighth generations in the United States. And the dynamics are definitely different under those circumstances, but the echoes of some of those things still continue to reverberate like a rock dropped into the middle of a still lake. The ripples are still coming out. And so I hope that some of these things will be translatable to your context. But I think the dynamics I want to explore are most pronounced between the first and second generation. And it creates kind of an epicenter dynamic where it just keeps spreading out and echoing down through the generations. I also want to recognize that I am technically an immigrant. I was born in South Korea. I moved to the United States in 1973 at the age of 5 with my parents. But I grew up most of my life, over 50 years here in the United States. So I'm what many have called 1.25 or 1.5. Some people are splitting those numbers pretty hard. Somebody said I'm 1.37. I don't even know what that means. But I do know this. I've had both the immigrant experience and the native-born experience to a large extent. And I think that has also informed some of the ways that I experienced the transition of generations. I'm also a church pastor. And so I'm going to largely address the context of church, even though I know some of you are serving in nonprofits and in parachurch ministries or in the academy, or as mental health professionals, all really important contexts in the care of people and in the serving of Christ. I'm going to speak out of the context I know, hoping and trusting that even if you don't work in the church, if you're a Christian leader, at least you are a part of a church. And these dynamics have likely affected you at some profound level, and you've brought that into your work in whatever context that you're doing. So all those disclaimers aside, I will say what I can say, and I will ask you to do the work of translating to your own context. Maybe in the Q&A part, we can massage some of those nuances together. I want to also acknowledge that we owe a great debt to the previous generation. I don't think that's expressed or acknowledged nearly often enough. But I don't know that my generation could have done the courageous thing of immigrating that our previous generation did. And many have given a nod to that, but I don't know how much quality time we've spent dwelling on what a profound thing it was. I even thought the last time I went to South Korea and walking around in the sea of people who looked just like me, but I was clearly being treated differently. And I thought, what if my parents hadn't moved and I just stayed in Korea? I grew up all my life feeling distinctive, good or bad, that I was other, and it forced me to wrestle with identity issues and with a sense of self-knowledge that I think many of my colleagues who are just like fish in water, they didn't know they're wet, they just didn't think about those things. I wonder how much of the immigrant experience forced me to reconcile with and wrestle through my identity issues. I thought, what if I had just been another guy in the sea of same-looking faces here in Korea? Would I have ever really had a sense of my distinctiveness or my destiny, the way that the immigrant experience forced me to go through? And so even that, as many of the pains that came with that are real, I have to say I'm indebted to my parents for what they did in my life. It's interesting, though, that having said that and earnestly meaning it, like every other generation before us, we've also had some difficult, negative experiences in our dealings with the previous generation. I don't know that many of us would have been motivated to be in a track like this if everything had been smooth sailing, we had no issues. I don't know that a track like this would even need to exist, but it exists because we all have collected some difficult experiences in the flow of generation. And we want to understand them and process them so that we don't carry that baggage around and are burdened with very difficult mental health issues related to that. So I want to very openly name some of those negative experiences, not with an eye toward being critical or casting blame, but understanding that those things have affected us. And if we don't begin by naming them and seeking to process them, we'll carry the unresolved baggage around with us everywhere we go. Observations in this workshop are coming from hundreds of conversations spent with both previous and next generation people and leaders over the last 30 years. I have to confess that my own experience at home with my parents and at church have been very, very smooth for the large part. I've been very blessed with the context I found myself in, but I've had hundreds of meaningful, deep conversations with people who didn't have that experience. And working with them and navigating with my own church has forged some of the most important insights and convictions about these issues. And so I want to acknowledge that I don't have a long history of pain in this area, but I've walked with many people who have. And I really want to see us as a generation learn to process those things better, because it's still affecting us. I want to ask, what is one story of a negative experience that you had in interacting with the previous generation? And if you feel comfortable, and I don't think we have time for a whole expansive story, but if you feel comfortable just in a sentence or two, just summarizing some of the different kinds of negative experiences typical between next generation and previous generation, can you call to mind some of those things that either you've experienced or that others have experienced? If you're on AirMeet, feel free to type some of those in the chat. I'd like to just kind of see if we share some experiences, if there are some common threads, even across ethnicities, national origin. I'm not comfortable sharing, at least hold that example of a story, a real tension. I did say that I had a pretty smooth experience, but I remember one incident where we were proposing a major change, and we could tell that the first generation leadership in the first year of our church didn't like the change we were proposing. And what they said was, you guys come up with a thorough document explaining every aspect of the proposal. And so we took that seriously, and we wrote a 30-page document, well-referenced, very well thought through, the result of hours and hours of meetings with our leadership team. And we submitted the document. They looked shocked that we actually did it. They said, well, we still don't change our minds. And I realized that that exercise was not intended to produce a document we would actually interact with, but it was a delay tactic so that they could continue dealing with their resistance to the proposal. And so that was just one example of an incredible amount of sunk cost into an effort that never really had any legs from the start. And it made our whole leadership team a little bit jaded and cynical about any future invitation to do some groundwork for new changes. So I think it made us a little skeptical that anything we did would be taken seriously at face value, that decisions were made before any real conversation had taken place. I want you to hold some of those things in tension. I remember working with the Spanish district when I was very active at the national level in this Christian Missionary Alliance. And they were sharing how frustrated they were because for the first time in their long history of immigration to the US, they saw an emerging generation who weren't at all interested in maintaining Spanish language, culture, and heritage. And we've been dealing with that for a while now in the Korean American setting, but they were having language issues and cultural issues. Now, these negative experiences that we have had often happened in our lives when we were emerging leaders. During what sociologists call emerging adulthood, ages 18 to 29, which those same sociologists characterize as the most self-focused life stage in the human experience. And because that's the case, and I don't know if that's what they're saying, but they're saying it's self-focused because you're breaking free from being under someone else's authority, but often by that age, you haven't picked up a spouse or children or others beneath you that you're responsible for. So your main concern is my own life, my own experience, my own direction. And so it's a very self-focused life stage. And a lot of the negative experiences that most shape us are picked up during those years where we're by nature largely thinking about our own experience and our own identity. And so it's likely that those experiences have cemented certain convictions and memories that are a bit biased because they were mainly assessed on how we experienced them and how they affected us. That doesn't invalidate those memories or experiences. I think it's very real and we need to process that. But that's only half the equation in understanding a thing that happened. There's this whole other side of it from the previous generation that we can easily mischaracterize or misunderstand if we only view what happened through the lens of how it affected us. And now that I'm a parent of 4 adult children, I'm a little shocked at how one-sided and lopsided their memories and evaluations of their own childhood are when we talk about them as fellow adults. I listen to their stories and I'm like, what house did you grow up in? I don't recall that atmosphere at all. That's not the way that they played out. And yet they cemented those memories as the folklore of their formation without at all considering the context in which I was in when I said the words that they remembered part of the film, because they're in every scene and everyone else is an NPC. Right? They're just a prop or a background scenery that comes in and affects us in some way. And we are the main character of the story. So I really repented of that because I realized how many times I had vilified the previous generation as having dark motives or looking to undermine me and my generation. Or I've even I dismissed them as being out of touch, irrelevant, totally unaware of what's going on. And I made those decisions to respond that way because I saw the pain in my compatriots and really resented how they were made to feel. But I also realized the other side of that story is what those folks were facing when they made the policies and decisions that so negatively affected us. I don't want to excuse or defend or invalidate anything. I just want to move towards fuller understanding and processing of the things that shaped us. And I don't know that that's really possible without adding into the mix this process called empathetic reflection, where we begin to think about what happened and what shaped us from a different angle than the one that we've always rehearsed, where we remove ourselves just for a moment from the center of the story and change the camera angle to look at a different character in the room. Some of the most engrossing films are the ones where they tell the same story, but they keep changing the angle. I don't know if you ever saw a Dennis Quaid film called Vantage Point, but it's a really cool device where you tell the same story, but you keep changing who the main character is. And it causes a story to evolve in radically interesting ways because you only see one side of the story most of the time. I think empathetic reflection, and I use that loosely as a way of saying I'm just changing the locus of the center and the camera angle by which I try to replay an incident. And I'm largely asking the person who affected me, what were they facing? What were they experiencing? What were they driven by? And the aim is not to excuse or defend, but simply to understand. What I see is that the previous generation faced a lot of pressures that I was generally not mindful of. And those pressures they faced produced anxiety. And when they played the role of leader in the home or in the church or at a business, those pressures they were facing produced anxiety that got expressed very often through the way that they exercise authority and leadership. And my generation bears a lot of scars from, I think, poor leadership dynamics that arose out of anxiety. It was maybe an incomplete response to the anxiety that those leaders were feeling. So I want to ask a question. What are some pressures that you believe the previous generation faced that are important to consider as we reflect on the way that that previous generation affected and shaped us? What were some of the pressures they were facing? Poverty, okay, certainly many were not as well resourced. Yeah.
They were alone and without perhaps supports, social or institutional, that they might have had back in the homeland.
That's right. So many of them in immigrating left behind their support structures and their key relationships. They felt very alone in a new place.
Language, they can't speak English.
Yes, yes. And the impression that that produces in others that betrays the deep intelligence and nuance that often lies under that inability to communicate.
And they don't have enough money after.
Yes, they hang on to their
Yeah.
position way too long because they don't have another plan.
The dad that they want to be polished.
Amen to that. Yes, I've seen that. And many in my generation who are now my age are deeply burdened by the responsibility they have to be their parents' retirement plan and pension because there was no other means. They didn't pay into anything that would give them a source of income. And the assumption always was, you are our retirement plan. And they're like, well, now I've got to do that for 2 sets of parents, and it's incredibly expensive. And all the while, it was always implied, assumed, never really discussed. But those are real pressures because immigrating creates financial upheaval. And when you're just trying to make it, your retirement seems like a thing you can delay forever because you're just trying to get from 1 week to the next, 1 month to the next. And those pressures that are faced by the previous generation produce a lot of anxiety. That's not a language that was common for the previous generation. They wouldn't talk about anxiety. In fact, if you suggested they were anxious, they would say, no, we just grit our teeth and get through it. We white knuckle our way through life because we're tough. And if you spiritualize it, because we trust God. I want to summarize some of the things that, and again, this is not from scholarly research, it's just literally hundreds. I've had so many conversations with previous generation leaders. I love what David's describing as an oral history. I've been doing that on video with my parents for a year now, asking them all kinds of stories, and it's fascinating to fill in the cracks of my parents' own history. But I've been doing that for many more years with first generation Korean American leaders. And as I genuinely listen to what they're saying, it's blown my mind how rich a texture there is to the background story of what they've done. It was so easy for me to caricature them when I didn't know their story at all. And I've discerned out of all those conversations certain key pressures that I think they genuinely faced. These are anxiety-inducing pressures faced by the previous generation. One of them is conservation pressure. That's my term. I try to be a good preacher. They're all C's. We'll see how I do. Right? The previous generation, especially if they were first generation, lived their lives awash in a sea of novelty and unfamiliarity. I mean, everything is new. You know, I've been at the same church for 30 years. I tried to write a resume for a program I was trying to apply to, and I realized I had one line in my work history. I've just been at the same church my entire working life. And because of that, I haven't been the new guy at a church in a long time. This past year, I took my first sabbatical in 30 years. I don't recommend doing that. I take it every 7. I almost self-imploded because of that. But during that 4-month sabbatical, I visited different churches almost every week. And it was very jarring to be the new guy every single Sunday for 4 months. I didn't enjoy it at all. It was overwhelming. It was a little bit like driving 120 miles an hour and sticking your head out the sunroof. Just overwhelming. The novelty of everything, it's kind of overloads your circuits and you're assessing, analyzing, feeling out everything. And I realized if that's what it feels like just to go to a new church for one Sunday, imagine when your whole world becomes a sea of novelty and unfamiliarity. In the oral history with my parents, I was noting how trivial some of their things were to me because I don't think about it, but they were saying that first month in the US, the smells were overwhelming. Nothing smelled right. It smells, America just smells normal. Well, America smells like America, but when you're used to Korea smell like Korea, the whole place, you're walking through the mall, minding your own business, and all of a sudden a new smell assails you, and you literally can't walk. It's just too much. And then it evokes all these homesickness memories and things. And I just thought, wow, what's it like to be in a place where the whole world is unfamiliar? It's new. And the truth is, I have never had to experience that in any lasting way. I have traveled the world, but I've never lived outside of the US since immigration. Many of them had seismic shifts in economics, in vocation. You hear the stories all the time of someone who is a very high-level professional and is now running a store or cleaning clothes for people here because that was the quickest way to begin earning income without going through the entire lengthy licensure process. And the psychological impact of being regarded this way and being underestimated compared to who you know you are, those things do violence to the human psyche. At home, many of them were experiencing terrible distress as well because they had a picture of how their family life, their children's pathways would turn out. And as the kids aged and became more Americanized, there was a lot of upheaval there as well. They were choosing pathways, vocationally, relationally, that the previous generation really didn't agree with. They were building spaces and structures, churches, businesses, homes that they deeply wanted to have their investment transferred to the next generation. And they would hear things like, we're not interested in receiving that from you. I remember for years, the Korean church would say to us, we want to give you this building when we die. And we had two questions. First, what day are you all going to die so we know when to get ready to take it over? That was a promise that wasn't really going to get fulfilled because they were going strong. And the other was, we don't really want this building. It's gross. It hasn't been paid attention to. That it hasn't been updated. They've saved money by doing all their construction work after 5 when the inspectors are off duty, so they could do it cheaply and without permits. And it was just, so it was like we didn't want it, and yet that was what they were hoping was to hand something down because they bled to build these things. And so that lost investment, they had such a strong impulse to build islands or anchors of familiarity in their life experience. They needed a place where things could be controlled, where things don't change, where they could be part of us and not always part of them. And at home and at work often, and especially where I come from in the Midwest, they couldn't have that in their work environment. They often didn't have that in their home environment because in the Midwest, unlike on the coasts, integration had to happen quickly or you couldn't earn a living. Many first-generation immigrants in the Midwest had to work for American companies speaking broken English. They couldn't create stores and all that just in the ghettoized Korean community. You had to integrate. And the kids all did that too. Most people in my church don't have any grasp on their mother tongue. But you go to LA and New York, I preach at EM retreats, and when the service is done, all I hear is Korean being spoken. It's really interesting because that's the heart language, even though they're perfectly bicultural and bilingual. And so there are these anxieties that arise because they want so badly to keep certain things the same. And at home and at work, they don't have that. But at church, they had levers they could pull to maintain familiarity and sameness. And they did that not to stop anything in me or my generation, but because they desperately needed a place that represented safe harbor in a sea of novelty and unfamiliarity. Again, that's not me taking guesses from a distance. I'm just summarizing many, many conversations I've had with first-generation leaders. There's also constituency pressure. This I would have never even known about had I not had many, many conversations with senior pastors from the Korean church. Many first-generation leaders, I found, were very, very open to progressive and innovative dialogue. They wanted to talk about it. They were ministry professionals like I was. They were relationally proximal to me and the other leaders. And so we enjoyed lots of really interesting conversations trying to forecast what's coming for our people group. What sea changes are we going to face in a little while? And they could run with us, and they were very excited about some of the changes we were proposing. But then they would return to their laity and find that their constituents did not see the same way. And very often what we would have is a senior pastor would promise something to the next gen leaders, and then they would take it to their elder board, to their congregations, and the people would say, are you insane? We can't do that. They'll leave. They'll take off. We'll lose everything. And so they would reverse all these promises. And I wondered why that kept happening. And I realized part of it was because there was so much threat of loss in their personal lives that they did not want to lose the same way in church. Their children were growing up, moving away, taking their grandkids with them to the other side of the country. No one was interested in taking over the dry cleaning business that they bled for a generation. But at church, they would come and see people who looked like their kids, but weren't their kids, but it became a trigger for all that they were losing. And they said, we will not lose this next generation. At all costs, you keep them with us. That was the thing I hear everywhere I go in the country among Korean American churches. We can't lose them. This is our church. These are our people, our descendants. We have to all stay together. And I now understand why that was such a strong impulse. But even when the previous generation leaders knew that change was needed, they faced a lot of pushback from their constituency. They could not lead freely the way they felt they needed to. I remember talking to the senior pastor of the Korean church that helped launch us. And he's 10 years older than me. But if I could just be honest, and I said this to his face, I said, you look like you're 25 years older than me. You look really tired. And he wasn't offended. He goes, I know. I have a mirror at home. He spoke fluent English. He's bilingual. And he said, you know what it is? It's early morning prayer. I hate it. What demon invented this idea of every morning at 5 a.m.? And he said, if I didn't have to do late night visitations where it would talk my ear off till midnight, I wouldn't mind getting up at 5 a.m. to pray. But to do both together is killing me. So I just asked him, why don't you cancel it? Why don't you make it 7 a.m.? Just do something to save yourself. And he goes, are you insane? I can't do that because the people will fire me and call me not a real pastor, unspiritual, unholy, for even suggesting it. And I realized then how strong constituency pressure is, how it creates so much anxiety in a leader because they may know that self-care or new directions are important, but the people who spend far less time thinking about those things are exerting pressure because they have their own pressures to keep things the same. They have familiar structures in place so they can measure spirituality, so they can feel good about the future of their lives. There's capacity pressure. You're working so hard at everything, they don't actually have the bandwidth to think about what comes for us. And finally, there's connection pressure, where there are not very many bridges to cross to form deep connections across the generations. They don't share the same experiences. They didn't grow up in this country. They weren't equipped to guide us. And so the question I want to ask is, how might we have advised them if we could go back in time to respond to those pressures, those anxieties? I would encourage them to admit their limitations. Just admitting that they were drowning would have engendered more empathy, more offers of real help, at least understanding and patience. I would encourage them to adopt a listening and learning posture. That's something I've only really learned to do in the latter years of my ministry career, truly be a listener and a learner to other people. Then to consult and empower what I would call native leaders, people who are expert in the places where I am not a subject matter expert. There's such a strong pressure to be the guy who knows everything. If you're Asian, even if someone says a word you don't know, you're like, I'll Google it later. I'm not going to ask anybody what that word means. I'm just going to go, yeah, totally. No clue what that means. Just admitting and saying, could we empower and consult other people? It taps into such a rich source of enrichment, knowledge that we are overlooking. And finally, I would encourage them to lead courageously when it's needed. I understand constituency pressure. I face it in my own ministry all the time. But I think it's so important that we lead courageously when that's demanded and required of us. We ourselves face a lot of pressures and anxieties today. There's so many of them. I can think of a few. Leadership mistrust. When well-known public figures implode and then explode, the shrapnel hits all of us. You mentioned one leader. Man, have we had to deal with the shrapnel of that explosion in Chicagoland. Accompanying that, when your heroes fail and fall, you begin to call everything they taught you into question. You begin deconstructing your faith. And on top of that, we have polarization. There's no shortage of issues that will divide a room. And people are so opinionated and vocal, and they will send you links to support their claims and proposals every day. We live in a binary culture. There's no more middle ground. Everything is one or the other. Leading in that context has become so difficult that the latest Barna polls show nearly 40% of pastors are tempted to quit the whole thing. I got to that point earlier this year, which is why my board mandated a 4-month sabbatical. It wasn't like, go and get some rest. It was like, you need to stop before we lose you completely. And God really healed me during that sabbatical. But there are reasons why we're finding it very difficult, and it's not as fun to be a Christian leader in today's climate. How are we going to respond to our own leadership anxieties? Well, I think we take the same advice we might have offered to the previous generation. Start by just admitting your insufficiency, by taking a learner's posture, a listening posture, by consulting and empowering others around you. Finally, when it's needed, though it's hard, lead courageously. And we're all going to have to do that. The world around us is demanding strong positions on things that we consider secondary to the core doctrines of our faith. They're making their decisions about where to be a part of a church, not on the basis of, is the Bible taught, is this true, but on where we stand on these social issues. And you know that being declarative about anything is going to split your church in half. It's going to make you very unpopular with some and the hero of others. And I like to think I'm impervious to those pressures. I don't care what people think. That is so not true, and it's bad for mental health to pretend it's true. It affects you. It paralyzes you, binds your hands as a leader, knowing that anything you decide today is going to split the room. And people will have very strong opinions, pro or con, regarding the way you exercise your authority. It's important for us to process the leadership anxieties and pressures of the previous generation, because I think it offers a window into how we might cope with our own leadership anxieties and pressures that we face today. The pressures may be different in nature and in detail, but the truth is that the dynamics are still pretty much the same. If we wish they had done it better, I think we ought to look in the mirror and realize we can also do it better ourselves, but not if we continue in that same way, learning some of those things like you're supposed to know everything. When you are uneasy, just take a command and control posture. Control it, pull all the levers, keep everything the way you want. If we take those cues from the distressed previous generation, we will make the same mistakes. We'll succumb to the same pressures and anxieties. And I think our lasting memories then of our ministry years will have a lot of things that don't need to be there. A lot of scars, a lot of regrets. Can I take 2 minutes to share a story of how we applied this recently? How many of you did okay in your ministry context through COVID? You did okay? Yeah, a lot of the churches in our area were destroyed by the whole thing. It was really rough. By God's grace, we did okay, but it threw all of us for a loop. Before I entered ministry, I was pursuing a doctorate in genetic engineering. So my specialty was virology and epidemiology. So this should have been right up my alley, but that was 30 years before I started the church. I'd forgotten all my genetics. And here we were facing a medical crisis that had deep social and ecclesiological implications. And people were demanding strong answers, but informed answers, policies, choices that I was not prepared to make. And I was overwhelmed because everyone had an opinion, and they would send me emails with links to seemingly reputable sources of truth that were contradicting each other. And I was like, I'm not trying to be a geneticist again or a virologist. I want to be a pastor, but I have to become knowledgeable on these things. And I felt very uncertain, and it produced so much anxiety in me and my staff and my elder board. You remember what it was like to try to decide, when do we come back together in person? What do we decide about masking? What's the policy if someone's sick or coughing? And in all of these things, we're like, we don't feel equipped. And in an age of fake news and pseudo news, how do you even know where to start learning about these things, to get informed about any of it? And so I began reflecting on what I learned from the previous generation. And I just told the church, look, guys, I'm a pastor. My trainings in theology, I am not equipped to give you the kind of responses you're asking for, but we have people in the congregation who are. And so while the elder board is charged with making the final decisions, we ask all the medical professionals in our church to come together and form a medical advisory board, and we asked them to do their best research. We trusted their cues. We also formed a COVID advisory council full of people in the legal, education, and social services and mental health professions to say, what are you learning in best practices from your vocational setting about how to respond to all this, what the implications are? And then they would advise the board, and we would have briefings on a monthly basis. And they were so helpful. We didn't necessarily agree with everything they said. We had to make the calls at the end, but we had a trustworthy source of truth that was empowered to advise us, because the truth was we were not equipped to make those calls ourselves. And just inviting others to the table in that important time helped take so much of the anxiety away. There was still a lot of difficulty in implementing those decisions, a lot of hard conversations to have. But whenever we made a difficult and declarative decision, we presented the reasons why, and we backed it up, and there it was. That's just one example of the story where I had to face a leadership anxiety, and some of the reflections and the learnings I had helped me navigate, in my own context, some of those things.